So yeah, we are talking about putting the fun in ABE funding. Hopefully some of the more fun aspects of this presentation carry over into this virtual space. And Kaija and I are both part of a group of teachers who are working alongside learners to do advocacy around adult basic education and how we can better fund our classes and better support our learners. And so we'll talk later about how you can learn more about IMABE. We can take a moment to introduce ourselves. I think we both have our cameras on for the moment, and then we'll turn them off. But Kaija, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Kaija Bergen, she, her, and I am an adult educator at Neighborhood House, and like Kris mentioned, part of the group IMABE.
And my name is Klas. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I'm also an adult educator and I work at St. Paul ABE at the Hub Center. Currently, I work from my bedroom, as I think most of us do, or at home at least. But when we're in person, I'm at the Hub Center. So. All right, I'm gonna quickly go over just sort of why we're doing a session on ABE funding today. So Kaija and I sort of set out to better understand how ABE is funded, because I think sometimes there's just so much information, and I've definitely been in sessions myself where it's just a person talking at me for a very long amount of time and I don't get all the details, and then I don't really know how to advocate for more funding because I don't really understand how we're funded to begin with. And so hopefully by the end of this, you'll have enough information about how our funding works that you'll be able to, at the very least, ask the right questions, if not really make the case for why we need more funding.
All right. So I'm going to start off by giving a history of funding in ABE in Minnesota, and also just an overview on how we structure ABE. And for some of you, you may be really familiar with this, and for some of you, it might be new. So the goal of this part is for us to all have the same baseline information so that when we get into the details of how ABE is funded, we all have the same operating knowledge. So to start out, ABE in Minnesota is unique because it's broken up into different consortia. And the reason I say that this is unique is that in most states around the United States, ABE is just sort of individually operated by each program. And so they are individually advocating for themselves, getting funding, whereas in Minnesota, we're in these regional groups. And generally speaking, there are three kinds of consortia. There are exceptions to this overview, but generally you've got district-based consortia, and these can be subdivided into school district consortia, CBOs, and county, or district-based consortia consist of, school districts, CBOs, and county correctional facilities all together. Another type of consortium is the community-based organizations. And then there's also statewide corrections. And so I'm going to give you a few examples of what that means. So when we're thinking about these district consortia, we have some large metro consortia that a lot of you might be familiar with. These are going to be things like St. Paul Community Literacy Consortium and the Minneapolis Consortium. And you can see that these consortia have a school district, and they're the ones who are the fiscal agent. And then within them, they also have lots of community-based organizations, or CBOs. So you might work at a CBO, but your fiscal agent is the Minneapolis School District. And so you kind of all meet together And you can see that these metro-based consortium are very large. There's 4,000 to almost 7,000 participants in the 2018 to 2019 numbers. And then we also have the Greater Minnesota Consortia, which are often smaller, and these are actually really diverse. And so when we look at these, we're thinking about places like the Detroit Lakes Consortium, Northwest Service Cooperative, Moorhead Consortium, and many, many more. And these usually have multiple school districts within them. And then you'll see in cases like Detroit Lakes, you can also have county corrections that are a part of your group. And the participant numbers can have a really wide range, anywhere from like 100 to almost 400 in the examples that we're looking at here. And then another example would be those community-based organizations. So these are a little bit different from the two district examples we looked at, because even though the district-based consortium can have community-based organizations in their group, these are CBOs that stand alone. So two examples of that would be Think Self and American Indian OIC. And you can see that these are much smaller because they are working with specific demographics of people and can be anywhere from 50 to about 150 participants. And then finally, we have the state corrections. And that consists of 9 correctional facilities. And you can see they've got a lot of participants, and they kind of operate as their own big group. So what I'd like to do is actually, sorry, Kris, if I could have us go back. We're going to do a poll just to see who's here. And we're going to, I'd like you to just tell us which of these best matches your situation. Are you part of a metro-based consortium? Are you part of something in Greater Minnesota, state corrections? Yeah, so take a moment and let us know.
It's kind of fun to watch these percentages go up and down as people respond to the poll.
Yeah. All right, I'll give everyone about 1 more minute. You should have a pop-up that you can answer that gives you some options for what your consortium might look like.
Sometimes it doesn't work for everybody, so I think when we get to about 75%, we can close it.
Awesome.
We're getting close. Oh, I don't know. Oh, there we go. I thought we were going to hit a plateau there at 68%. We've got to about 78. Should we?
Yeah, I think we can publish those results. And so you can see we've got folks from all over. Thank you for sharing. And this is great because when we're going through this funding presentation, I want you to think about your own consortium and what's unique about it. But I also want you to think about the people who are in all of the other ones too, and think about sort of the diverse ways, the variety of ways that we offer ABE across the state. And that brings me to our slide on funding. So we can close the poll, and ABE is funded primarily through 2 main sources, and that's federal funding and state funding. And the federal funding is based entirely on contact hours, which I think we hear a lot in ABE as being a source of funding. And then the state funding is based on a funding formula that we're going to look at more in depth in a minute. But that also includes some contact hours. And every year that contact hour rate is set for both the federal and state funding. And so we have one more poll for everyone now, where I'd like you to take your best guess, or maybe you already know for sure, and tell us what you think the 2021 contact hour rate is for the federal government and for the state funding. So we've got 2 questions in this poll.
I think they fit pretty well in the window, but occasionally people have it pop up that they can't see both at the same time. And there is a scroll bar, so you can scroll down if you sort of move towards the right-hand side of your window. I like seeing that there's a variety of responses. That means not everybody knows the right answer.
Which is good. If you all got them correct, then we just have to say, all right, well, thank you.
Yeah, you guys can take it from here. We're gonna go home.
Yep. All right, and give people a couple more seconds to respond. All right, and I think maybe we can publish those results
too. Maybe we can share, yeah.
Yeah. All right, so we've got answers across the board, but for the federal contact hour rate, it is 73 cents. And we have a handout that I forgot to put in the chat here, but that you can use to come back to this information later. I think we'll get that to you. And then so the federal contact hour rate is 73 cents, and the state funding is actually that $7 amount. And Kris, I think we can pull those up on the slides.
Oh, yes, thank you. I've got my sharing results in the way here. There we go.
Great. So you'll see that there's a really big difference in these two numbers. And when we give this presentation, I think it's important for us to take a moment to really appreciate the investment that Minnesota has made in ABE, because the federal funding is really small. And a lot of states are trying to run ABE programs with only a little bit of state support, or in some cases, no state support. So if you think of a state like Texas, Texas runs its programs using the federal funding only, which to me is a really overwhelming idea when you think about kind of the opportunity that Texas ABE probably has. And so we say, thank you, Minnesota, for having this large commitment. While at the same time recognizing that even with this $7.74 contact hour rate, we are still operating a lot of shoestring ABE programs where we could genuinely use better funding to help our participants, and that's what we're here to advocate for. But I think it's good to start by appreciating what we did get. So now we're going to look specifically at that funding formula that's for the state of Minnesota. This is how we divide up money beyond just contact hours. So the funding formula was developed in 1999 to 2000 by a statewide group of ABE and community ed staff. And the goal of it was really to look at all those different consortia that we were looking at earlier and figure out how can we develop a way of distributing the money that we get from the state in a way that kind of addresses the unique situation that all of these different programs have. And so the funding formula was the answer to that. And so in addition to having this contact hour aid, we have something called base aid. And base aid is given to all of the district-based consortium. So if you think about those CBOs that were outside of a district, they are not eligible for base aid. And if you are a CBO within a district consortium, you also don't receive this base aid unless you've negotiated something different with your fiscal agent, with the school district. But I don't think that any CBOs have. So base aid is comprises of three things. And the first is that you get $1.73 per person in the population for your area. And that's based on census data, which is one of the reasons why the census was so important, only one of the many reasons. And then the other way that it's calculated is you get 8% of it comes from the number of limited English proficient students that are in that district. So this is a number for the school district, but it assumes that the parents of these kids are probably also going to be in need of some of our ABE services if the kids qualify. And then the other 8% is for the number of adults that are over 25 years old in your area that don't have a secondary credential, so something like a GED or a high school diploma. And then after you've calculated the base aid, the remaining 84% is based on these contact hours, which this is kind of a confusing formula. So we're going to break it down a little bit more in the next section. But at the end of this year, what we have is a federal funding pot of about $5.9 million. Then we've got state funding, that's about $49.8 million. And we're going to divide all of that up among these 39 consortia.
All right, so as Kaija said, we're going to try to break this down a little bit so that it's a little easier to digest and understand. And so we're going to do that in a couple of ways. The first way is just we took some sort of anonymized data about some consortia, and then we rounded the numbers to make them a little friendlier. And we're going to look at how the funding formula works out for those different types of consortia. So during this section, if we were in person, we'd have someone come up and spin a wheel and then award them their funding dollars in sort of a game show type of way. But just kind of keep in mind what kind of consortium you're a part of or your program is part of. And you can actually keep track of your dollars. I think, I can't remember whether it was Carla or Jody was going to put the link to our handout in the chat for you all to download. So if you want to keep track of it, it's a Word doc, you can keep track of it there, or just get out an old-fashioned paper and pencil as we go along. So we'll start out with a Metro District-based consortium. I'm part of one of those. And we're going to look at what kind of funding do they get from the federal government, and then what do they get from the state of Minnesota. So these red dollars here are representative of federal funding. And you remember from what Kaija said that that's strictly based on contact hours. So this example Metro District had about 557,000 contact hours. And so if we multiply that by the rate, that 73 cents, we get about $412,000 from the federal government allocated for this district. Now, we've got two parts to our state funding. So the first part is contact hours again. And this district gets about 560,000 contact hours they can count. Now, you might notice that there's a little bit of a difference. Why do they have 560,000 contact hours for the state, but only 557,000 for the federal government? And that's because federal contact hours don't include things like GED testing. So some consortiums have, or some programs have a GED testing site within their program, and they can count hours for that towards their state funding, but not their federal funding. So this program has about $4,088,000 allocated for their contact hours. And then they're also going to receive that base aid that Kaija was talking about. So for their total population, their census dollars are about 720,000. The number of LAP students in their district allocates them another 400,000. People over 25 with no diploma or secondary credential allocates them another 300,000. And so that gives a total of $1,420,000 of base aid. If we total those state dollars up, we've got about $5,508,000 from the state of Minnesota. Next, we're going to take a look at Greater Minnesota District-based consortium. And so these programs, as Kaija mentioned, are typically a little smaller. They get that federal funding as well. So here we have about 8,800 contact hours, and that's going to allocate them about $6,000 in federal funding. if they get that same 8,800 contact hours, they must not have a GED testing site in their program. They're going to be entitled to $64,000 from the state of Minnesota. And then finally, they're going to receive base aid as well. So they've got 100,000 based on their district's population, 12,000 for the LEP, no diploma 54,000. So that totals 166,000. We add that up, they're entitled to about $230,000 from the state of Minnesota. But we have my little error symbol coming up. So there is a rule in statute that if we go back and do the math, we take that total and we divide it by the number of contact hours, that 8,800. If it is greater than $22 per hour, that they're not going to be able to receive all that money. And so when we do the math here, they're going to hit a cap. And so they're only going to be able to earn $22 per contact hour. And so they're going to kind of lose some of that base aid and just have a total of $22 times their contact hours, which gives them about $193,000. For this example, to kind of explain it, we're saying that they're returning $37,000, but in reality, they're just not going to see that money because they hit that cap. And then finally, we're going to look at one of those Metro CBO-based consortium. And so for federal dollars, they've accumulated 9,200 contact hours over the program year. And so that comes out to about $7,000 in funding from the federal government. It looks like they also have a GED testing site in their program. And so they've got 9,600 contact hours. And the state is gonna award them $70,000 for those contact hours. Now, Kaija mentioned that CBOs do not receive base aid. So you can see $0 for the census, $0 for LEP, $0 for no diploma. And so their total is gonna remain at that $70,000 awarded by the state of Minnesota. Okay. That was kind of a quick run through. And so this next section, and those are based on, you know, sort of real or sort of rounded real scenarios. This next section, we're going to do what I like to say is like break it to see how it works. We're going to see what happens if we have some sort of exaggerated disaster scenarios. So our first disaster scenario is a tornado that just rips through the metro and destroys a couple of ABE programs, buildings. And they lose about 8,000 contact hours. So in our metro district, we're going to reduce their contact hours for this program year down to 552,000. Multiply that by the contact hour rate, and they've got about 4 million. So that's $58,000 less than they would have gotten if they had their regular amount of contact hours pre-tornado. They will still receive the same amount of base aid. That amount doesn't change unless the population significantly changes. So they're going to end up with about 5,505,000. Our CBO, also in the metro, is going to lose that 8,000 hours. So now they're down to about 1,600 contact hours, which gives them a total of 12,000, which is also $58,000 less. But remember, they don't receive that base aid. So their program's budget for the next year is $12,000. Finally, we've got our Greater Minnesota Consortium, which there wasn't a tornado in Greater Minnesota. So they are able to maintain their same amount of contact hours, that 8,800. So they have the same amount of contact hour funding, and their base aid is going to be stable, but they're still hitting that cap. And so they're only able to really earn $22 for each of their contact hours, and their total is going to be $193,000 again. Our next disaster is something that is sort of driving people out of the greater Minnesota area, and there's a huge population shift towards the metro of about 7,000 residents. And so we can see that's going to affect the funding of the Greater Minnesota Consortium in their base aid. So they really worked their butts off. They still accumulated 8,800 contact hours in this program year, but their base aid, their population goes down. And so they're going to only earn $143,000 of base aid, about $23,000 less than they would have if that 7,000, those 7,000 people hadn't moved out of the area. But their total still comes out to $207,000, and they're still hitting the cap. So this program is actually able to still earn the same amount of funding for this year as they would have, because that cap keeps it at a relatively stable amount. The Metro Consortium is seeing a surplus of 7,000 people added to their population. So if they maintain the same amount of contact hours, that amount of funding stays the same, but their base aid goes up. So they've earned $23,000 more in their base aid. And the CBO might also see a number of students enrolling in their program who have recently moved to the area, but they don't receive more in base aid because they're not allocated any funding for that base aid. So their funding is going to remain the same.
And now we're going to talk a little bit about what happened with COVID-19. So hopefully you've been able to see, as we've gone through these different scenarios, how the funding formula is kind of designed to shift based on the number of contact hours each consortium is able to get, as well as sort of the population that they have to serve in their area. But with COVID-19, it kind of broke everything because what happened for everyone was that contact hours went down across the state, right? And different programs were impacted in different ways in terms of their ability to provide synchronous or asynchronous learning and the ways that they were able to track all of that as well. So the Minnesota Department of Education made the decision to look instead at how we can develop an equitable way to fund all of these programs given the sort of unprecedented times. And so there were a couple of things that happened this year. The first was that because programs all were kind of shut down in early March, we changed the fiscal year count. So usually we're counting hours from like July to June, but instead we shifted so that the hours that were used to calculate how we distribute funding actually came from March 14th, 2019 to March 13th, 2020. So those were times when programs were theoretically all operating in normal circumstances. In addition to that, the Minnesota legislature appropriated an additional 3% of funding for ABE, and that's good because that allows us to divide up more money for these different programs. And then the other update is that that was all for fiscal year 2021. And for the fiscal year 2022, right now the plan is to reuse again those hours from March 14th, 2019 to March 13th, 2020 as a way to distribute that money. Just because there's a recognition that the way that we've counted this and the way that we've calculated how programs are performing is really changing, and it's more difficult to track that right now.
Yeah, I wanted to just say we have this sort of uh, pizza graphic on the screen, and that second point about appropriating an additional 3% of funding is really important. Something I've been reflecting on lately is the way that our budgets don't always stay at the same level, even if our funding does. And so even as we have taken some of the pressure off by reusing those contact hours, teacher pay contracts and things like that continue to increase. And so our budgets are still growing, and we keep dividing the same size pizza, the same size pot of funding up into different size slices. If we have more contact hours, we make more slices. There's smaller slices, but we had more contact hours, so we get more small slices. If our contact hours go down, we make less slices, so they're bigger. Sometimes that makes it look like we have more funding because we have a higher number of contact hours, but of course, we're getting fewer slices. The point being that we really need to make bigger pizzas. If we want to get more pizza, we need a bigger pizza. And so those types of percent increases for the total amount of funding we're being allocated are really important. All right. So I think we had planned to do these questions for discussion in the chat. Kaija, how are you feeling about where we are time-wise? Do we want to go into breakout rooms, or should we do this in the chat?
I think maybe let's keep it in the chat. Just
okay.
We're done at 11:45. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. So here are some things that we want to think about after we have sort of gone over how the funding formula works. I think we saw some ways that the funding formula as it is really benefits us. There's some fail-safes sort of built in. And then there are also some challenges, right? We saw places where a significant drop in contact hours is really going to affect some program budgets. So sort of reflect on these two questions for a moment. And as you have thoughts, go ahead and put those in the chat. I'm going to pull up my chat box so I can see it. Uh-oh, that's not it. There we go.
So maybe we'll start with benefits. What are some benefits that you can see with this formula?
And if you're trying to find your chat box, it is, if you're on a computer, you can look down towards the bottom. It looks like a little text bubble, and then it says chat underneath. If you click on that, you should get a pop-up window that you can type into.
Additionally, if you have some questions about this, you can also chat us the questions first before you tell us what you see the benefits to be if you have some outstanding questions about it.
Absolutely.
Some folks might be typing right now, and so I want to give you time to do that. I'll say also, one of the things that I thought was really interesting when I learned about this formula and how we kind of distribute this stuff is the challenge of balancing the need for programs in places that might have smaller populations. And so like thinking about greater rural Minnesota and how you might have lots of small programs spread out that still need to be providing services and still need to reach people, but who might be in competition with like the metro area that has like a very large population, and how if we're trying to think of a way to balance that, so that it's not just based on contact hours, I think the funding formula tries to do that by looking at the like total populations people have to serve.
Yeah, having that sort of base aid there as a foundation means that if you don't have enough people to accumulate a ton of contact hours, your program's not going to be completely without funding. They still have to be able to pay for space, pay for staff, pay for materials. And so that base aid kind of prevents them from operating on too small of a budget.
Another thing that was like a surprise to me with this, oh, and we've got a comment here. I'll say quickly is I was surprised by the difference between the federal and the state funding amounts. And it made me think a lot about how we focus on our advocacy for that. And Deb says, one challenge we faced was being moved to a different building and our contact hours really dropped drastically. When we were moved again, our student enrollment went up drastically, but our aid was still on those lower hours. So we had super full classes as we could not afford to hire more teachers. And I think that's a really good point. This is based on kind of how each consortium does every year. And one of the things that can be tricky is if you've got a consortium that has a lot of different groups in it, you kind of create a buffer for each other, right? I know that's happened for the St. Paul Community Literacy Consortium, which I'm a part of, where if one program has a rough year, we're kind of supported by others. But if you're in a smaller group, then you can really face challenges like Deb described.
I think too, pointing out that it is a reimbursement system. So it's very much dependent on how you did the previous year. And so I think we've seen over the last several years, things like refugee resettlement numbers, which have gone down and down and down, means that there are fewer and fewer incoming students enrolling in programs that used to have a lot of newly arriving refugees enrolled in their classes. And then, you know, at some point, we hope that that's not going to be the case anymore. The borders will be open again. And as the coronavirus has sort of shifted how the employment landscape looks as well, people are coming back to ABE saying, I need to skill up. We'll have incoming refugees enrolling in our classes, but we're going to be based on numbers when we were much, much smaller. And so that really limits what we're able to do because we have far fewer dollars and far more students. Thank you.
And I would say that also leads into that idea again around increasing the size of the pizza, right? Because if you have a program that's really operating with only the bare minimum, then you don't have a lot of flexibility if something changes drastically in your numbers. And Abdi says the formula has proven high effectiveness in delivering its services. It has resulted in lots of innovation and effectiveness. And I would agree with that. I think that one of the things we've seen during the pandemic is I think that having a we all do better when we all do better attitude around how we distribute funding and how we support our programs statewide has been important for keeping some of our programs from having to close their doors because of the pandemic. Any other challenges that people would add or benefits or questions?
As folks continue to type, I wanted to sort of piggyback on what you were saying, Kaija, about the way it's really been great to have this sort of perspective during the pandemic that we want to continue to just do our best to serve students' needs. And I know I have felt a huge, and I think programs across the state have sort of sighed a huge sigh of relief that we don't need to worry about contact hours, that we can really focus on how to best serve students. And that's something that I hope we can find a way to continue beyond past the end of coronavirus, whenever it does come, is how can we fund our programs in a way that allows us to focus on best serving students and not have to chase contact hours. Whoop. Apparently, scrolling up switches slides.
Well, and we might be at a point where we want to talk about that slide.
All right.
And
Yeah,
if anyone wants to add anything in, please don't feel limited by us switching over, but
it is time. All right. I can't remember if this is you or me, Kaija, but I think we can both kind of chime in here. We just want to encourage folks, if you are feeling inspired to join us in advocating for ABE funding, or continue to, if this is something you're already involved in. Some next steps that we have we are still planning on doing a day on the Hill where we go speak with legislators at the Capitol on Tuesday, March 9th, 2021. I think it's becoming clearer and clearer that that is probably going to be a virtual event. But I'm excited about the possibility that if it's virtual, that transportation is not going to be an issue for people who are much further from the Capitol. And this is an event for both students and staff. So last year we had large groups of students who were able to tour the Capitol, but also get to speak with people who represent them about their experiences in ABE and why it's important to them. We also encourage you to reach out to your representative. If you don't know who your representative is or how to get a hold of them, you can follow this link. Literacy Action Network also has a legislative committee, and I know it is sometimes challenging for teachers to get involved because meetings happen during while they are teaching at times. But if you have the time and you're available to get involved, they always welcome more people to get involved. And then finally, Kaija and I spoke about our involvement in MN ABE. And so here is the URL to our website. And then there's also a Facebook page for MN ABE if you want to find out more about our work there.
And the last thing I would add with that is, first, I want to thank everyone for joining us and coming to this. And also, I want to just share that a big motivation for me in learning about funding and talking about it with all of you is because I think that it can feel really disempowering to not know who's in charge of your job or who makes decisions around all of that. And so understanding that really, a lot of our programs are dependent on funding because of our funding from the Minnesota State Legislature, and that is a group where you can really have a strong impact in advocating for your students and yourself is something that, I don't know, it makes me feel like I understand how my job exists and kind of what I can do to guarantee it continues. And so I hope that people feel that way as well. And if you are interested in getting more information beyond these, please contact us. I think that's our last slide has some contact information on there. You can email MN ABE. And we also included Jody, who has been our tech assistant, because Jody is the real expert on all of the funding. We have spoken with her a lot to get this information. So if you've got something really detailed, she's a better person to email.
The real expert, yes. All right, it is 11:45 on the dot, Kaija.
Woo!
Yeah.